Without further ado, welcome to our speaker, Professor Tony Lang.
Thank you, Caroline. That was a really lovely introduction. I'm not sure I'm worthy of it. So, as you can see, my topic today, rallies, riots, and representation, constituent power at home and abroad. And I'll start by saying I'm going to tell a few stories, but one of the things to keep in mind is while this is a lecture in the Institute for Legal and Constitutional Research, I approach constitutionalism not as a legal expert, but as a political person, as a political theorist in particular. And that's why I'm focusing on these rallies and riots and the very question of representation. I'm going to talk about law a little bit, but my focus is really going to be more on the political side of constitutionalism, because I've always found that to be not better, but more interesting to me. And I think it's something, certainly as someone raised as an American, when people think about constitutionalism in the United States, they really think about as the Constitution, as the text, as a set of legal debates, which it is, but it's also a political practice, a set of political practices that I'm going to try to speak to today. All right, so quick overview. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. The big questions, two questions, and this is a question I've been trying to think about, not necessarily about rallies and riots, but the larger question of constituent power for some time now. So I got interested in rallies and riots recently, and are they more representative than legislatures and normal politics? And are they more effective than normal politics? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with a couple stories of some American rallies and riots, talk a little bit about some of the ideas around representation. What does representation mean? Drawing out some political theorists. Then translate that into constituent power, which I'll try to explain as well. Turn back to our friend James Wilson, and who actually I think can help us here. So it's not just a Wilson lecture in his name, but I'll be using Wilson a little bit. Then turn to one regional set of rallies, riots, protests, a couple global ones, and then try to draw everything to a close. So we'll see if this works, and hopefully it will. So let me start with the American example. So the first is, again, James Wilson. So not a lot of people know this unless you know the biography of, and I'm going to come back to Wilson, and I'll give more context about him in a few minutes. But there's an interesting story about him, which is become known as the attack on Fort Wilson. So on 4th of October, 1779, protesters attacked the house of James Wilson, which at that time was holding a number of people, all of whom were considered the elites of Pennsylvania society at the time. And the people who were rioting were really protesting for economic reasons, rising inflation, and price controls, and Wilson and others represented this economic elite who they were resisting. Okay, there was also a related conflict over the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution, which happens to be which was at the time, it's changed, but was one of the most democratic constitution of the early American colonies. The protests were led by Charles Willson Peale. So if you know that name, he's a famous painter of American founders. So the famous painting of George Washington is by Willson Peale. The conflict was eventually quelled by the Philadelphia militia officers, although the militia were also involved. I'm just giving you a snapshot of a couple different riots and rallies. So I'm not going to go into too much depth about this one, but it's interesting because Wilson was considered to be the target of this. Maybe for justified reasons, I'm not 100% sure. The second one is, some Americans may know this a famous example. It's called Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion was a set of revolts revolts, revolutions, rallies, protest movements that kind of occurred throughout 1786 and 1787. Again, largely for economic reasons. So they were demands that were being made at the time from primarily foreign manufacturers who wanted to be paid in hard currency by the Americans. And that was hard to come by at the time because of the kind of economic and political uncertainty in the United States at the time. And what was happening is tax collectors and courts were enforcing these rules on the poor throughout Massachusetts and in other parts of the colonies as well, but particularly in Massachusetts. So these folks really generated some very strong resistance to this, and their targets were the representations of the constitutional enforcement of these economic rules, that is courthouses and judges in particular. So they refused to allow judges to meet who were trying to enforce bankruptcy laws upon the poor. They were led by this one guy, Daniel Shays. So sometimes people say this riot was actually about, these riots were about revolutionary soldiers getting paid. There was some of that, but a little not, it really was more this broader economic set of issues. And what's interesting is that the federal government at the time was rather weak and couldn't really bring any troops to bear to help quell this. So eventually the Massachusetts state militia had to be brought in to quell this. So I'm going to come back to the consequences of it in a minute. Two more contemporary ones. So we'll quickly shift from over 260 some years of American history up until more contemporary events. So the next one is the Black Lives Matter movement, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. And these are a set of social political protest movements that really resulted from police killings of young black men, in particular, other kind of related issues, but largely around the deaths of young black men by police forces. And it was really, the spark was in July 2013. This police officer, George Zimmerman, was acquitted of killing Trayvon Martin, which had happened in 2012 in Florida. And this really kind of galvanized people and set off it was a spark that set things off. And so then there's been a number of these, well, unfortunately, a number of killings of young black men by the police since then. But then a large number of protests and really a really kind of sophisticated body of web activism that's taken place since that time. There's three women who are considered the kind of key leaders, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Ope Tometi. I'm probably not pronouncing them accurately. But this has generated, there's also now more of a global Black Lives Movement matters, which I'll come back to in a bit. So again, just giving you some snapshots here. I'm going to come back and try to spell this out a bit more fully later. The last American one, I love the picture of the shaman there. I wanted to use that picture, but we couldn't use that picture for the advertising of it. And that's a particularly good picture of him shouting. So this is the Save America rally, which took place on January 6th. And these were protests, as I'm sure you're aware, that took place in support of Donald Trump being elected to the presidency for a second term. And the rally was organized initially to stop Congress from verifying the electoral votes. So they were they kind of gathered near the Capitol building, and eventually, for lots of reasons, which have been discussed extensively, made their way over to the Capitol building and attacked the Capitol building and invaded it. So it was a very kind of, it starts as just a traditional rally with Donald Trump saying how great he is and how he should be reelected, and then turns into something more. And this is a great quote from a social media post, a lot of which has been collected by the report that was put together by the U.S. Congressional Committee. So there's a lot of great kind of data out there about this rally. Okay, so these are four kind of, I think, really interesting. I mean, again, I'm only giving you a quick snapshot of them, so not in detail yet, of four moments, rallies, riots, conflicts that took place in both the early American context and later. And I'm interested, I mean, I got interested in this from the Trump rally. It's really what got me starting to think about this and seeing how a group who was attacking the kind of pinnacle of constitutionalism, the legislative branch, claiming to be more representative than the legislature actually was. So that got me thinking, like, not that I support the agenda of having Donald Trump reelected, but it does seem like because I think he clearly lost, but it does seem like an interesting moment, the way in which that protest movement came about and what it claimed it was standing for. So I really did led me to ask what this question of representation. What would it mean to say, could we even say that a rally or a riot is representative? We don't tend to use the term that way. We don't use the term representation to describe rallies or riots, but I think maybe we could, and there's something interesting there. The other question is about effectiveness. Do they change anything? Do they lead to anything new? Do they lead to any new developments? And I'm interested in those kind of two questions and how they intersect with each other. All right, so let me turn for a couple minutes then to some political theory, since I'm a political theorist, that's what I do. So that's what we'll start with here. And there's two kind of, when we talk about, so I'm going to just to try to describe what representation is as a concept. So there traditionally are two concepts of representation when we think of formal institutions. That is the trustee version and the delegate version. So the trustee version is famously captured by Edmund Burke, the Anglo-Irish politician from the 18th century, who some people argue his political ideas really are just covers for his political interests. I don't think that's true. I think he's a really interesting figure and thinker when it comes to conservative and wider kind of political issues. His writings on aesthetics, for instance, are fascinating to read, which he wrote when he was 19, which tells you something about. I didn't write anything like that when I was 19. So this quote really captures, and he's got other quotes which say this, but this speech to his constituents in Bristol: "Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment, and he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion." So not what we normally think of as a representative, right? I mean, representatives are supposed to do what we want them to do, but Burke's account is that no, they're supposed to somehow represent you in a different way. They're supposed to create for you something that you may not even know you need. Interesting, just side note, you know, all the conflict around the Bristol, the statute, et cetera. Burke, in representing Bristol, was actually extremely opposed to slavery. So this was actually a speech in which he was countering the economic elites of Bristol and the political elites, saying that I don't agree with you in supporting slavery, so this is why. So I always think that's, in light of current events, an interesting point to add. The delegate version, I could have picked any number of people. Pick an American, obviously James Madison, who I'm sure you all know, one of the founders, key figure, who was the author of, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, these famous texts that justified and explained the American Constitution to the American public of his day, which were published as newspaper articles. And in Federalist Paper number 10, which is probably the most famous if you read the Federalist Papers, he makes the case that representatives are clearly delegates of the people. And this also, interestingly, is why he justifies interest group activism. And that's why the American political system leaves space for interest groups in ways that other systems don't formally do. So in any case, but Madison believes clearly that it's not the case. He disagrees with Burke strongly on this, and he says that this is not, we're not supposed to change what our constituents want. We're supposed to do what our constituents want. And his argument was that bringing all the representatives together and having a large state, part of his justification for the Union, you can actually quell the factions that may emerge from individual interests. So we've got two different kind of theories, in a sense, of representation here, which have been long standards. However, there's I think, a much better account that's more specific, and this is one for anybody that studied, that's learned American political theory. This figure she's very important, still alive. Her name is Hannah Pitkin. And she wrote a number of things over the years, but the book she's probably most famous for is this one called The Concept of Representation. And I'm going to use these four, the book is more extensive than this. It's much more interesting than just these four kind of standards. But I want to use these four throughout the rest of the lecture as a way to think about how representation can or should maybe work. So for Pitkin, there's four types. There's the formalistic form of representation. That is what we think of as legislatures, more institutional forms. And by having more institutional forms, they're authorized to act in our names, and also they can be held accountable in ways that other actors can't. So that's the first type of representation. But she goes on in a helpful way to distinguish others we might not automatically think of. So the second she calls symbolic, and that is standing for someone, right? So somehow an individual represents us and embodies us somehow. So Hobbes, for instance, on the famous Thomas Hobbes, the English political theorist, in his book Leviathan, has on the front cover a picture of the king with all these little bodies inside it. And that's the kind of idea of the symbolic representation. Although she doesn't quite use Hobbes in that way, but that's a nice graphical representation of it. The third is the descriptive form. That is, somehow you resemble. There's some characteristic by which you're similar to those who are representing you. So, this can be across any number of characteristics. It could be ethnicity, it could be race, it could be class. that's a different kind of representation. It may overlap with the formalistic one. It may overlap with the symbolic, but it is a distinct one. And then the fourth is probably closest to Burke's notion, that is the substantive account, which is that you're acting in the best interests of the representative. They may not even know what their interests are, but you're acting for them, okay? So again, keep in mind these four concepts, and I'll keep coming back to them because I think they really do some good work for us in not just thinking about a legislative body or an executive, but help us think in, I think, new ways about riots and rallies. All right, but I'm going to introduce one other concept. Again, I hope I'm not introducing too many concepts here, so try to keep up. I'm sure you're all taking notes extensively here. Right? And that second concept is constituent power, because one of the things I've wanted to do in this lecture is link the idea of representation to constituent power. So constituent power is probably the fuzziest of the terms that gets used when we think of constitutionalism. We think of the rule of law, we think of human rights, we may think of separation of powers or the balance of powers. The constituent power idea is kind of in the background, and it's never really defined. It's almost one of these things you try to grab it, and it doesn't quite exist. It emerges, I'm sure everyone is, well, I'm not sure, but you may be aware, it comes from the French Revolution, famously from this moment. I'm not going to go through the whole French Revolution, but there's this moment called the tennis court oath that took place, and that is the third estate was locked out of the deliberations around the French Revolution. And so they gathered in this tennis court that was nearby, and they declared that they are, the third estate being not the nobles and the clergy, but basically everybody else, declared that they are the ones who are truly representative of France, okay, in this revolutionary moment. And importantly, in that oath, they demanded a constitution, a written constitution, and that's kind of how this notion of just these people declaring themselves in this role becomes what we would call constituent power. Now, there is a theorist of this, Abbé Sieyès, who is a priest, although it doesn't seem to be a very strong believing priest from what I've read about him. And in this famous text, What is the Third Estate? He kind of lays out the justification for the position that's taken by the third estate by saying, we are the third estate. It is all of us. And this is what's more important than the nobles and the clergy. And we shouldn't be dividing up society this way. And of course, we know this leads to the way the French Revolution progresses. So constituent power emerges in this French Revolutionary moment. And it's hard to kind of, again, capture what it is. I always, those of you, some of you from my constitutionalism class will have actually seen this slide before because I'm recycling it. This is what constituent power really is. It's both an empirical idea and a normative idea. It's empirical that there exist people who can be found, seen, heard, and that this people they actually historically created a political order. It's also important to note, though, it's not just a historical idea because constituent power manifests itself continuously as people engage in political life and they challenge politics. And that's how it becomes also a normative idea. It's an origin idea against which we can evaluate our contemporary politics. And it can lend itself to democracy. It's not quite the same thing as democracy because it's the underlying kind of structural framework that enables political action to take place. So it doesn't mean you have to have constant revolutions to see constituent power. Constituent power can be more in a referendum, which we've clearly had a number of referendums. And so that's a classic expression of constituent power in a referendum, okay? Now, I'm gonna link up here just quickly these ideas of, this is my PowerPoint, gave me this design option. I don't know if it really looks that good. You know, you put a little design, give me the design. This is what it gives you. So representation goes, how does representation get to constituent power? How are these things linked? So it's representative somehow at the outset, that is at that moment of founding in some way, right? And it's representative at moments of change, moments of kind of conflict and disruption. And it's representation leading to hopefully some sort of permanent institutional form. So constituent power shouldn't just be something that's free-floating, but it's a way in which a representative act leads to something institutional, formal, and hopefully permanent for a time, as long as it's working. So to me, this is how representation connects up with constituent power. And I think one of the things I'm going to try to do going forward here is argue that representation to really be effective and functional should turn into constituent power. To me, that's what's most, maybe both normatively beneficial, but also most effective when constituent power, or I'm sorry, when representation, acts of representation become acts of constituent power. And that's in particular when I'm looking at, I mean, it's slightly different when you're talking about a legislature, an executive, or judiciary. I'm interested in how people's actions out on the streets somehow can maybe be turned into constituent power. Okay? All right. So that's my kind of, sometimes I wear my social science hat and I call this a hypothesis. I know there's lots of historians here, so they probably like, ew, what's that? So a proposal might be better. But rallies and even riots can be representative of the people. To be effective, however, they need to become a form of constituent power, okay? And using Pitkin's framework, remember those 4 terms, they move from being substantive to formalistic, is one way to think about it, and they move away from being symbolic and descriptive. So I think what's interesting when we, and I'll go through this in a minute, when we start to look at different rallies and riots, the more symbolic and descriptive they are, the less they're easily translated into constituent power, and the less effective they become, right? It's not they don't just have to be formalistic. I think the substantive, and here I don't want to be too Burkean, but the substantive is actually also important. If they have a normative structure or agenda behind them, I think that's crucial for them to be effective. Okay, so having thrown all these concepts at you, let me come back to our hero, James Wilson. And I think Wilson is actually a helpful figure for us. I'm not just using Wilson because this lecture's named after Wilson. He actually is really a fascinating figure. So as Caroline mentioned in the beginning, he was born not too far from here, Cascardew Farm, right outside of Cooper. My sense, I've tried to find it, and my sense of direction is so bad I could never quite find it. So I'm hoping at some point to go there, but I just am like, it doesn't appear as easily as I thought. So he attended Cooper Grammar School, 1750. Now I have question marks here because he did attend. We know he attended the University of St. Andrews. He probably didn't matriculate, though. He probably didn't get a degree of any sort. We have records of him taking books out of the library, but that's about all we've got, I think. And then he also attended the University of Glasgow, and they tried to claim him. But he's ours, I think, not theirs. But as Caroline said, he moved to the colonies and arrived in Pennsylvania. He worked as a tutor, he was an apprentice, and then eventually he was an apprentice to a lawyer, which is how you became a lawyer in those days. You didn't get a law degree, you just worked for a lawyer. And then became very involved in the politics of the early American Republic, particularly in Pennsylvania, but then more widely. So he was both a Pennsylvania delegate to the Continental Congress, which issued the Declaration of Independence, and a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention, which issued the U.S. Constitution. So he's one of, I think, 6 people that signed both the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution. After the founding of the American Republic, he went on to become a professor of law in Pennsylvania and then served as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He wanted to be the Chief Justice, but George Washington decided not to appoint him to that role. And he is the only Supreme Court Justice who ended up in jail. He invested heavily in Western land speculation, which was a big thing for a lot of the founders of the time. He was not very successful at this. He lost a ton of money, and he actually died in jail, in debtor's prison. So this is one of the reasons why was for a long time not one of the most favored founders. He did not have the best reputation, unfortunately. He was seen as someone who maybe was smart and everything, but didn't quite conduct himself the way the virtuous founders did. He didn't own slaves, however, like lots of the virtuous founders did. So, so that's just his life. But what's interesting about his ideas here? One of the things he did, one of the first things he wrote, which was really important in the American Revolution, in 1768, he published this pamphlet, Considerations on the Nature and Extent of the Legislative Authority of the Parliament, where he highlighted that many Americans growing up hear the story like the colonies were objecting to King George. Wilson was very helpful to say, we're not objecting to the monarch, we're objecting to the parliament. It's the parliament that's the problem. They're the ones that are disenfranchising us, and then as a result, he did a very long and intricate study of what it means to be represented and what true representation means. And it's not just as simple as the American story, like no taxation without representation. That's the famous rallying cry. There was more to his ideas here, and it's worth reading the paper, which is easy. You can easily Google it. It's available pretty quickly to find. The other place where so this is one of the things he wrote that he was known for in his day. He played a very active role in the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So he is someone that was a strong, and this comes to his notions of representation. He advocated for direct election of people to the U.S. Senate, which, if you know anything about the U.S. history, that was not how the U.S. Constitution was first designed. Senators were elected by state legislatures, and so it was a kind of indirect form of representation. Wilson argued unsuccessfully to have a direct election. He also argued for a direct election of the president, not this kind of complex electoral college structure that exists in the U.S. today. So he was didn't succeed on that one, but they were both efforts on his part to really make representation central to the American political system. I have there from the American dollar bill, I think it's from the $1 bill, an image of the pyramid, which that's kind of Masonic or something, I don't know. But the reason I have it is because Wilson continually uses the metaphor of a pyramid to discuss and argue for how representation works. He said the people are at the base and the government only relies on them. So he's one of the few people that turn to this metaphor pretty actively. Now, the other kind of key thing, and this is an ongoing discussion that people who are interested in this stuff have. So the text of the American Constitution was written at the end of the summer of 1787 by what's called the Committee of Detail. So 5 or 6 people were said, you guys, we've had these debates all summer, you write the text. And Wilson was on that text. He was also recognized by everybody as the leading legal mind of the day. Now, because everything originally that was written about the American Constitution came from the pen of James Madison, most people think James Madison was the one that wrote most of the Constitution. False. We're pretty clear, it is pretty, and I'm not just making this up, there is evidence for this, that Wilson is the one that coined the phrase, we the people, which has become probably one of the most famous phrases, not only in American constitutionalism, but constitutionalism more broadly. I mean, the United Nations uses the beginning, we the nations of the world. So there's this kind of way that this concept is crucial. And we're pretty sure that Wilson is the one that crossed out the original thing that said, we the states authorized, et cetera, but it was Wilson that turned it into we the people. And this was a really important shift from seeing the Constitution as a kind of treaty amongst different colonies to something much more fundamentally representative of a people as a whole. It's a clear moment of constituent power manifesting itself. So Wilson is really useful in this. I've also got here that he was very actively involved in the 1790 Pennsylvania Constitution. So he played an active role there as well. Okay, let me just say something quickly about, because Wilson also wrote extensively on law, and he gave these lectures on law in 1790 when he was first appointed to the first chair of law at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was attempting to systematize the law for the American Republic. And this was a pretty big deal for not just him, but for many later throughout the 18th, 19th, even into the 20th century, was a kind of very fundamental text about articulating an American version of law. George Washington and others were in attendance for his first lecture. And this I think this sentence really captures the whole approach, which is the supreme or sovereign power of a society resides in the citizens at large, and that therefore they always retain the right of abolishing, altering, or amending their constitution at whatever time and in whatever manner they shall deem it expedient. So this is really a clear statement of constituent power, maybe even something that would justify a rally or a riot to change a constitutional order. Maybe that could be a stretch. Because he didn't think, though, that these things should take place without any kind of normative basis. So he tried to balance his interest in what he understood natural law to be, which is the kind of link between morality and law. So not just that anybody can make any law, but law does have to be grounded in something ethical, something normative, right? And so there's an older natural law argument, but Wilson's, and here I would defer to those of my colleagues who know more about the Scottish Enlightenment. But Wilson, I think, certainly, and there's some really good work that's been done around the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment on Wilson and his thinking. His understanding of what law, where law comes from, I would call as part of this common sense philosophy. It comes from the people. So in some ways, it could be a very positivist or just what the people want notion of law, but he does try to connect it back to a moral sensibility. And I think Wilson is really helpful on this because he's arguing that law is not, as many natural law theorists argued in his day, some divine thing or something that comes from only wise people, but it's from a people coming together. So again, Wilson's trying to balance the politics of constitutionalism with the law of constitutionalism. All right. So Wilson, I think, can help us here. I hope. So first of all, he is wary of riots. Remember, his house got attacked with him in it. So I'm not sure he's a huge fan of big revolutionary actions, but he's also clearly supportive of revolutions. That's what he's arguing in the Considerations pamphlet. So for him, protest does have a place, but I think for him, protests must be substantive, and they need to lead to some institutional form. They can't just be out there with no structure and not lead to any agenda or goal, right? So I think here he's articulating exactly what I'm trying to articulate, this link between representation and constituent power. All right. So let me just quickly review the American rallies and riots that I mentioned a few minutes ago, and use Wilson and Pitkin to help us think about them. So the attack on Fort Wilson was, as I said, about the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776. It was also an economic, but it was also partly about people were objecting they were objecting actually to Wilson and others' efforts to change the Constitution, to make it less radical and into something else. That's why there was a mob that attacked. So I think Wilson may have been on the wrong side on this one, so maybe he was justified in being attacked. I'm not so sure. But what it did do is it led to the process of creating the 1790 Pennsylvania Constitution. So it did in some ways lead to a new thing. In the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1790 and further ones, Pennsylvania does have, with a single legislative body, it does have one of the more representative constitutional systems within the American state system. So it is important to recognize that. So to me, this if we want to use those Pitkin categories, it was descriptive in some ways because people were acting for their economic, they felt represented by their economic interest there. And it was substantive and it eventually became formalistic. Shays' Rebellion, remember this is the one that took place the year before the American Constitutional Convention. And many people have argued over the years that it was one of the major reasons why the Constitutional Convention was called, because people like George Washington panicked because they saw how weak the federal government was. And they said, we've got to create a much stronger political system. And so it generated a real strong interest in turning it into something more formalistic. So again, we've got something that's descriptive, substantive, and more quickly formalistic because it leads to the American Constitution. Now, I'm not making a causal account here. Again, put my social science hat on. I don't want to be too causal about this, but there is evidence that suggests people look to Shays' Rebellion as a worry. What about the Black Lives Matter? It has led to some formalistic. It's created this, there's something called the Movement for Black Lives. And there is some evidence, there's some really interesting evidence out there that it has led to some changes in policing culture, the way data is gathered, and again, this is in the United States, and the way public opinion about race and policing. Like now, I read a study that said over 50% of white Americans now believe the police are not treating Black Americans fairly, which seems like duh. But it's also the case that this was not the normative kind of assumption before. And actually, and this could be just the Biden administration, federal oversight of policing has now been reinstated in a lot of kind of problematic cities. So there has been some changes that have happened. It's also the case, though, that the movement for Black Lives has been mired in some controversy over funding. There was a whole debate about where their funds were being used. So there's some difficulties there. And there's certainly not been any American constitutional change. So there hasn't been a huge shift that's happened. So it's descriptive, very much so, right? Because it's a shared understanding of race. And then it's also strongly substantive, though. So it's protecting the rights of Black Americans, but very weakly formalistic. And I would suggest maybe that's because it's too descriptive. Maybe it doesn't have a strong enough, maybe the descriptive element is undermining its ability to become something more permanent and longstanding. What about our good old friend Donald Trump and Save America rally? Well, it was focused on just one person, right? It's focused on just this guy getting reelected. Really, Donald Trump has become this odd figure who can speak to people and claim that he represents them in a way that he's totally not representing them, right? So he's got this really interesting ability to claim he's representing while he's not. There was also a large amount of institutional resistance to Trump. As we saw, Vice President Mike Pence refused to go along with what Trump wanted him to do. And even Fox News celebrities like Sean Hannity were calling Trump and trying to get in touch with Trump and tell him, stop this from happening. This is going to look bad, et cetera. So there was, I'm not sure Sean Hannity's a representative of institutions, but he is kind of now in the United States. So this is a quote that Trump posted a year or so after, which was generated a lot of debate. And my mother used to send me emails when she was alive, and she would always capitalize things. Like she really wanted. I feel like Trump is like capitalizing things for that reason. But the key quote here is he's talking about how it's all fraud. My election just. He says a massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. So basically, Trump is calling for a toppling of the American Constitution, right? Because he didn't get elected. So if you step back and think about that, now this could be just Trump in his bathrobe and drinking his Diet Cokes in the middle of the night. I don't know, but that it is a kind of moment. You're like, whoa. So this one, the institutions of the United States have not changed, and in fact, I think they've become stronger as a result. Trump calling for overriding the Constitution. So this rally and riot is strongly symbolic. One person representing everything. Very weakly descriptive. So he doesn't really map on to these people in any way. There is a substantive to it, though. I mean, there's a call for lower government, smaller government. So I don't want to dismiss the substantive claims involved. But as a result, not very formalistic. And I think it's because it's too symbolic in its representative nature. That's why I think this one fails. Okay, I'm going to move away from America now, and I'm only going to go for a few more minutes here because I would love to have a conversation about these issues. So I'll just take a few minutes to walk through a couple other cases. So one is the Arab Spring. Caroline mentioned I taught at the American University in Cairo, so I have an interest in the Middle East. And the Arab Spring is a great example of a series of revolutions that break out across a wide set of areas. I mean, I'm highlighting here Tunisia and Egypt, and of course it's spread to other parts of the Arab world, generated by lots of different things. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they're young activists. Really, it was an online kind of revolutionary moment as well. Scott Whale Ghonim, a Facebook employee, was really one of the key figures behind certainly in Egypt, getting the process going. So this is a picture. The top is of the Tunisian one, and the bottom here is in Tahrir Square, which is the main square in Cairo where the protesters gathered for a long time. My colleague Adham Saouli has written some really good work on how the actual protest movement in Tahrir Square were incredibly polite. It looks like you can't have a polite protest movement, but the way that people conducted themselves in this massive throng of people is surprising how it kind of evolved, and I think it's worth thinking about that as well. So, okay, so there are these revolutionary moments that take place. What kind of representation are we talking about? Let me just look at Tunisia and then Egypt real quickly. Do they lead to anything? So the Tunisian case is really fascinating. So we removed their long-standing authoritarian leader. They got a picture on the top. They create a constituent assembly, which rewrites the constitution. Islamic and secular parties share governance, and it was seen to be, up until last year, one of the most successful revolutions in terms of creating a democratic outcome. Really kind of strong political system, real viable debate. The current president, Kais Saied, he is turning into what appears to be an authoritarian Arab leader. So it's in some ways the revolutionary impetus maybe has been lost. I'm not sure. I'm less an expert in Tunisia than I am in Egypt. So in any case, it did seem to have a strong kind of positive outcome. Egypt, a little less so. It had a moment of a strong kind of positive outcome. So you had Hosni Mubarak, the longstanding president, was removed. You had this new Constituent Assembly that was created, and then that wrote a new constitution, electing this guy, Mohammed Morsi, and the Muslim Brotherhood, who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood took over the parliament. Mohammed Morsi wasn't exactly a very effective leader. He was then quickly removed by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who was the defense minister and becomes president. And then in 2014, a new constitution is approved, and el-Sisi has become increasingly authoritarian. So you have these kind of very exciting moments of constituent power, but then they seem to not go very far. They seem to not turn into long-standing, what we would hope would be a democratic outcome. So they're both, though, very democratic and representative at the first glance. The riots, the rallies, the protest movements were incredibly representative and incredibly exciting throughout the Arab world. But then somehow they become authoritarian again. Now, some people argue that the global neoliberal structure, certainly in the case of Egypt, probably as well in Tunisia, forced back the politics into this authoritarian mode. And also COVID, certainly in the Tunisian case, is one of the big problems that took place. So these protests were very descriptive. So they were, because they were across the Arab world. I would call them anti-symbolic, which is, I'm changing Pitkin's ideas here, and I have to think this through more, because they're directed against particular leaders. They're definitely substantive. I mean, the abuses that Arab citizens had been subject to for so long makes their claim for human rights and democracy much more understandable. And they were formalistic for a time. And I'm not sure if my hypothesis works here. Maybe it does, I'm not 100% sure. Let me conclude with the two global ones, since I like global constitutionalism, and I care about global constitutionalism. So there have been global protests. So a famous one that occurred some years ago, you maybe forget by now, but the Occupy movement, remember that? People coming into the streets, starting in the United States, but it was really a global one. I mean, it spread throughout the world in many ways, and many people claim it was inspired by the Arab Spring and a couple other revolutions that were taking place in Iran and I think in Hong Kong as well. Very much an economically oriented protest movement. Very much about creating a more socialist economic system. You know, they're occupying Wall Street. That's where the phrase comes from. So I would call these protests substantive, anti-symbolic, though not directly to say the leader, but against wealth, if that makes sense. But very weakly formalistic, and certainly not descriptive, because the people involved come from so many different places. So that's one example. Another is the Black Lives Matter movement, again, turned global. It wasn't just an American movement, and it certainly made its way here in the UK, France, Colombia, New Zealand. There was a lot, and I love again, just Google searching this, find Koreans for Black Lives Matter. It's I think that's a great moment there. So it really has forced conversations about racism and police brutality, but of course there's no global change that's taking place. Nothing radical is taking place in terms of creating a new global order that protects Black people or people of color. So it's descriptive, although again, this becomes complicated when you have Koreans for Black Lives Matter, and you know, what does that quite mean? Anti-symbolic, so it's not, it's at least in the US context, and in other places it has been about policing, so directed at police brutality. Definitely substantive, but very weakly formalistic. So again, trying to use Pitkin's categories to help me categorize these different protests. One economic, one political. Both seek to change existing institutions in domestic contexts. Are they truly global? I'm not sure. And I don't know if we've ever really truly seen a global protest. These to me seem close to it. And there's probably other ones out there. I'd love to hear if you think of other ones. So they're largely substantive, I would say, with little or no descriptive or symbolic elements, and certainly not formalistic. So this might disprove my argument about my hypothesis in some way. So conclusions. I created a nice, again, just putting my social science hat back on. I created a table. Table's already good graph. I don't have any graphs, but you know, I got a table at least. So this to me, and I'm happy if you're interested, and again, when I say it's social sciencey, of course I'm interpreting these events this way. So this is my effort to kind of locate these categories, or locate these moments, these protest movements, according to Pitkin's structure. And then I have the last is about success. So was Fort Wilson a success? Not really. The Shays Rebellion, yes, because it created a new constitution. That's the clearest success we have. The BLM, Black Lives Matter in the U.S. context, maybe it's successful. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. The Save America rally, no, not really successful, I would say. Thank goodness. The Arab Spring, maybe. And who knows? I mean, you know, the arc of justice, what is that King quote, is long. And so maybe there'll be some change. And again, I've got not yet as opposed to maybe for both the Occupy and the Black Lives Matter movement there. So I'm not sure I'm being a good social scientist, I'm not sure my hypothesis is proved. And I want to do some more thinking about this. I mean, what I'd really like to do is collect data about protests around the world and try to categorize them according to Pitkin's framework and see about, you know, and try to find, are there global ones that do exist? I'm not 100% sure. But the last point here, just to say, riots and rallies, I think, are forms of representation. To answer my first big question, I do think they are representative. And they can, I think the ones that are descriptive can be the successful. Rallies, so that's a can, that's maybe. Rallies and riots that are symbolic or anti-symbolic may be have less chance of being successfand I think the most important thing is that the ones that are substantive have probably the best chance of leading to kind of successful outcomes. The substantive, I'm linking constituent power. So I think the ones that link that lead to kind of an expression of constituent power are the ones that are substantive. So again, this is my effort to try to think about constitutions, constituent power, and protests and riots and rallies, whatever you want to call them, through this lens. And I hope it made some sense, and I would love to hear your reactions to it. So that's it for me.
Super. So everyone queue up in a very orderly fashion.
Yeah, right. No rioting. Yeah, right.
Shout your questions.
Yeah.
So we have plenty of time for questions.
Great.
Tony, are you okay?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So please,
Who
love to
likes
hear
first?
your queries. Yes.
Thank you. Really interesting. When I was listening to your examples, I was thinking of especially Vietnam protests. And that bundled up with figures like Michael Watson and John Rawls.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if there's anything to your knowledge in their writing that links into constituent power and sort of like formalizing like rallies and protests.
Yeah. So I don't know for sure about either Walzer or Rawls, two political philosophers, if you don't know American political philosophers. From the things I've read, and I've read a bit for both of them, they don't use that term constituent power. I mean, Rawls talks about, rules and constitutions, but it's not quite the same way. And Walzer seems more interested he did write about political protest early in his career. That was one of his first books. So that would be one thought. But it's interesting about the Vietnam War protests. Those did lead to important institutional changes in the American context, right? I mean, so in 1974, there was an election to Congress that was largely Democratic, and that Congress changed the way the U.S. Congress functioned. It decreased the ability of committees to have the power they used to have, because many people thought the old school politicians who got them into Vietnam, including Lyndon Johnson, were too fixated on using the Congress in that way. So it opened up the U.S. Congress in a new and interesting way. So you've given me a good example here. That's a good example, because it did lead to a change. Again, there's an indirect step from the protest to the election of these people to the change in Congress. But I think you could trace a line there. But on your question, I don't know the answer about Walzer or Rawls. I'm not sure if either one of them evoked the term. But thank you. Yeah, Todd.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering about sort of where you place institutions. It sounds like there's something kind of external to the rallies,
Yeah.
what's going on. What about potential sexual riots or, well, riot is rebellions within institutions, sort of the blurring of that line, where the institution begins and where the constituents end.
Like, can you give me an example? What are you thinking
I
of?
mean, sort of in terms of the Trump example,
Yeah.
I mean, you've got people in these institutions
Yeah.
inciting
Yeah,
these
yeah,
actions.
right.
I wonder where that's sort of, at what point do you and your analysis sort of cut off where that sort of begins and ends?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, just to think of the U.S. context, I mean, you see it more recently in States of the Union, American States of the Union addresses by presidents, where you have members in the audience, that is members of Congress, shouting out things and, calling the president a liar, or, so there is are those examples of rallies or riots or protests? I don't know. And whether or not Trump himself, when he was president, represented something like that, he did try to disrupt American politics in a number of ways, and he did, right? And he did change American politics in many ways. But I guess I would draw a line between formal institutional structures and the kind of things I'm interested in, only as a heuristic device to see what the relationship is. But I think I think the line is blurred. I think you're right, there's a blurring there that certainly, I mean, you look at parliaments around the world where people get in fights, and, you do see this not just in the US context, but in many places. And I think so that could be evidence of this kind of thing too. So yeah, that's a good question. And it also makes me think, I guess I haven't thought about this, it makes me think of the Tahrir Square example. When a protest or a riot or a rally becomes organized institutionally. So the Tahrir Square protests were very organized at a certain point, and people were distributing food, and they were doing all the things that you would think almost like a government should be doing. So there's interesting ways in which in some cases that also happens, which is kind of the opposite of what you're asking too. But Rory, yeah.
An interesting example might be the Gandhi and the rallies against British rule.
Yeah.
Well, I actually pushed a little bit on this idea of representation.
Yeah.
And scale.
Okay.
Because one can make an argument that riots and rallies are often expressions of opinion and anger.
Yeah.
But if we're thinking of them in terms of the population of a state and the potential size of an electorate, even if it's a pseudo or democratic, pseudo-democratic state, then you're actually talking about relatively small numbers of people.
Yeah.
So to what extent can you actually call a riot, even if it has 1 million people, representative? Because to me that would actually, if it does force change, then that could also be compared to just terrorism, right? You're using violence to force political change.
Yeah.
And actually it's quite a small number of people potentially making that change on a majority. So that doesn't really sound representative to me in any kind of meaningful sense other than just people expressing an opinion. Yeah.
No, that's a great question. I mean, in original, I did many versions of these slides. Originally, using Pitkin, who talks about this issue around numbers and representation, right? I mean, because it is a complex question. To what extent? Does the British Prime Minister represent everybody in the United Kingdom? Not really, especially the way this Prime Minister was elected by the Conservative Party in a small number of people. That doesn't mean he's not representative, though, right? He's not representative of every single person in that delegate model. He's maybe representative in some slightly different way, right? So I think I would come back and the first thing I'd say is I don't think numbers equal representation. It doesn't matter. I mean, it does in a way, and that's why we have a complex electoral system to try to create representation across different structures of governance, right? So that would be my first thought in answer to your question. I do think you're right. An individual or small group of people could act in such a way that they're trying to take over a country or whatever, as terrorists or however you want to put that, claiming to be representative of the truth. I'm more interested in the representative nature of how you represent people, not the truth. So that is a complex one. Pitkin has some things to say about this. So when I talk about substantive representation, that doesn't mean representing the truth. It means what's best for the people. So I don't know, that maybe I'm being too subtle there.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a good
I
question.
say a lot of people who would think of as terrorists would argue that they represent people.
Yeah, they represent people, right? And I think that,
That's true.
yeah, so if we think of, let's say, Islamic terrorism, that's a very descriptive form of representation. Like, I'm representing all Muslims because we're all the same, which, and I think is a false kind of, not false, I don't want to dismiss descriptive representation. I'm most suspicious of descriptive representation. So even though I think the Black Lives Matter movement is incredibly important and strongly substantive, I get worried about rallies and riots that are primarily around a descriptive characteristic, whether that be race or class or whatever. That becomes, I think, problematic. So, yes, Jay.
Thanks very much for that. It's very stimulating. Two examples that I kind of expected to see but didn't see. One was Ukraine.
Okay.
It was this extraordinary movement that we saw, which is a physical rally that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and created and overturned the Constitution.
Yeah.
Of the examples that are around, that one struck me as
That's
the most obvious.
Yeah.
But the other one, which is a much smaller scale and maybe more theoretically interesting, is France. Not the French Revolution,
Okay.
but the fact that when they get cheesed off, they take to the streets
Yeah.
and start throwing the pavement
Yes.
out. Right?
Yeah.
And it's almost institutionalized in French society
Yeah.
that is a legitimate form of representation.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
what do you make of that?
I think that's great. I'm glad you raised that one. That's a great example because, and I don't think it's an accident that the idea of constituent power appears in France and the French Revolution. I think, it's sometimes hard to trace, a revolution almost 300 years ago up to today. But I do think that spirit of the French Revolution is part of why, as you said, it's almost like the protests are institutionalized. Like, we're going on to protest, we have the yellow vests on, let's get to it. I mean, there's, I think, an interesting way that does link up maybe with that. That would be my only hypothesis there. I don't quite know, but that is a really good example because there are multiple and overlapping protests too. And I'd also be interested in, union activity, right? I mean, that would be another form of protest, clearly. I mean, we've had it here at the university and universities around the UK. We have protests around for various unions. So how those function too would be interesting to think about as well. I also wouldn't call a strike though a rally. That's a different thing because it's target. Again, I'm riffing off what you said, so I'm taking your question a different way. But it goes to the French one too, because there are oftentimes protests that are not about changing the whole system. They're strikes directed toward pay or structures of working. So I think a strike does something slightly different. I'm not sure how I would categorize it in relation to what I'm doing here. So. Any others?
Yeah, one thing.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
So thank you for the talk, I really enjoyed it. I was just curious if you could talk a bit about if you think riots and rallies are more effective in the long term if they're operating within the bounds of the laws of the society. So if they're lawful, either riots or rallies, or unlawful riots or rallies.
Yeah. That's a really interesting one, and this is where I think Wilson can be helpful for us. So I think it depends on what you mean by within the bounds of, like, if you get a permit and you kind of protest officially and you don't break windows and you don't hurt other people, those are the kind of protests I'm interested in. I'm less interested in things that turn violent because I'm a big fan of Hannah Arendt, another political theorist, and her argument is that once violence comes, she doesn't know pacifist, so she says violence does take place. But that moves us out of politics. So once we become violent, we move away from politics. Now, it's also the case, though, that protests have to push against unjust laws. So think of South Africa, right? I mean, that protest movements over time had to shift an unjust legal system into something else. So I don't think a protest should be bound by law, but I think it should be nonviolent to really be effective, would be my answer. Yeah.
Thank you for the really thought-provoking lecture. I was wondering if you could speak as to if there were any sort of systems of grouping protests based on external factors. because we were talking about global equivalencies where certain protests are similar to others. But in the example with talking about terrorism or how a minority may not be representative of a majority, in different states there would be systems of sort of, there can be situations where the minority is protesting because they aren't able to do so through other systems, whereas in other places they could, but they may still not do so for other reasons. So we can see these groups both as minorities, minority groups kind of speaking for majorities, but one may be sort of having less access to being able to speak while the other can't. And are there ways that we differentiate these?
Yeah, I mean, so the minority kind of issue is tricky, right? I mean, because on the one hand, I think of James Madison talking about factions, right? He was worried about factions. That is, any group that acts against the self-interest, that against the national interests of the state. But interestingly, Madison also claims in Federalist Paper number 10, that a faction need not be, it could be a majority, it could be a faction, and which is an interesting idea to think of, like how a faction could be the majority of the people. And that's maybe where he gets closer to Burke about having a substantive idea of representation. But to answer your question, I mean, yes, I think certainly minorities do have to, and whatever they're characterized by, will sometimes need to act in ways to establish their rights. Oftentimes they're not trying to change the system as a whole, however, right? They're trying to ensure their own protection in for whatever reason they may be discriminated against or whatever that might be. So I think that's important as an example. I don't know how it would fit into I'm interested, I guess, in outcomes that lead to large-scale constitutional change. But that doesn't mean it's not relevant. It just maybe doesn't map onto my framework in the same way, I guess I would say. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it does. I just guess kind of picking up on a couple of the last sort of questions. I mean, what room do you have for this? What the people who are there think they're doing? Because some of your examples are much more obviously like aiming at something like constituent power, like Tower Square or something.
Right.
Maybe Occupy, so I guess that's questionable about how far that is. Say something like when everybody goes to James Wilson's house in Brexit. I mean, another way of reading that is like economic protest, 18th century moral economy, where you're raising a set of issues that you actually don't want to upend the system, you just want the people in charge to do something about it.
Yeah.
So when you say, well, I don't know James Wilson's house in that way, but maybe they thought it was a success. They got the changes that they wanted. It's that intention and desire. There is I mean, over the years I've been reading in fits and starts literature on protests and protest movements, and there's really interesting stuff that it's so hard to tell why individual people are engaged in protests and what they think they're doing and what they want the outcome to be. Like there's lots of stuff I've read about the Occupy movements that people are going to these protests to meet a partner, as opposed to actually trying to change them. Which is a perfectly good reason to go to a protest. I mean, look at the '60s. That's what happened in So I think that you're raising a really good point. I mean, both about the particular attack on Fort Wilson, but how important the intentionality of those engaged in the protest is. And again, maybe I'm turning the protesters into some unified whole that's not justified, and I could take that critique, and I'd have to think about that. Because I think it doesn't make sense to ask individual people what their intentionality is, because that won't get us very far, right? I mean, and the people become something when they arrive on the street, even if me as the individual don't quite understand what I'm doing or why I'm there. At some point, it coalesces into something different than what I intend. I guess that's one of the dilemmas of politics more generally, how individuals relate to community action or political action. Not a good answer, but I mean, it's a good thing for me to think about as I go forward with the project. How is it that, and again, there's huge numbers of debate. People have written about protest movements, about how you're supposed to understand the intentionality, and nobody seems to have a good answer from what I've read, and maybe there's more out there, so.
Time for one last question, please.
I just want to hear your opinion about Russian strikes. I mean, they have some attempts before the war in Ukraine against Putin's regime, which were led by Navalny, which were not succeed, and they did not succeed. They had several days of demonstration on the first days of war, against war, but they still did not succeed. And it is interesting that they have like more than 100 population in Russia, which is much more than policemen in Russia, which can arrest them. And still they did not succeed, and they did not make any other attempts to continue their strikes. Why do you think is it possible? Is it because they do not care about the level of their lives? Maybe because they most of the population supports the war, supports Putin, or what is the reason of that?
So I can't give you a very good answer, Alex, because I don't know Russia as well as that. So my office is next door to my colleague John Anderson, and he and I talk quite a bit, and he's a Russia expert and knows Russia very well. And one of the things he did tell me about the protests against the Putin regime, both prior to the war and even after the war broke out, was that they're really confined to the big cities, and the majority of the population throughout the rest of Russia is more than happy to just go with what Putin says and not and believes in what, and that could be, media, the way the media functions, which is another dynamic. I didn't really talk about how media creates, impetuses for revolution or for protests. So I don't have a good answer for you on this one. I'm sorry, just because I don't know the Russian context well. But it would be interesting to use this framework I'm developing to think about it. I mean, I think that would be useful to do. Since you're in my class, you could write an essay on this. So perfect for your essay topic. All right.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, everyone. A set of excellent questions. Apologies to those of you who I think there are a couple more hands, but there is a reception taking place now. So please, everyone, come and join us in the Undercroft in 71 South Street. Follow the crowds.
Right. The massive protest going on with the reception.
And I think in the meantime, it just remains for me to channel the spirit of James Wilson and call upon we the people to thank our wonderful lecturer, speaker this evening. Thank you, Tom.